The high noon sun hammered the town of Redemption, Arizona, bleaching the color from the sky and baking the dust of the main street into a fine, suffocating powder. For Emma Carter, the heat was a constant oppressive weight, a physical manifestation of the grief that had settled in her bones months ago. From behind the counter of Carter's trading post, she watched the town simmer. Men leaned in the slivers of shade offered by wooden awnings, their faces grim, their talk low. Life on the frontier was a slow grind, a battle waged against heat, drought, and loneliness. Her father, William, had seen opportunity in this harsh land. Emma now saw only a monument to his failed optimism, a crude wooden storefront filled with goods she couldn't sell to people who had no money. Since his death, the townsfolk had treated her with a cloying mixture of pity and contempt. They saw a woman alone, a delicate eastern flower destined to wither and be blown away by the first harsh wind. They didn't see the steel that loss had forged within her. The sudden thunder of hooves shattered the midday stupor. It began as a distant rumble, growing with unnatural speed into a full-blown cavalry charge. But this was no cavalry. A dozen riders' faces hidden behind dusty bandanas stormed into Redemption with the terrifying precision of a seasoned military unit. They moved without a single wasted motion, their horses disciplined, their rifles already in their hands. Chaos erupted. Men scrambled for cover. A window shattered. The double-barreled roar of a shotgun from the saloon was answered by a volley of disciplined rifle fire that silenced it instantly. Two of the riders dismounted and blew the door off the Redemption Bank with a stick of dynamite, the explosion rocking the trading post and rattling the glass jars on Emma's shelves. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her first instinct was to grab the heavy Colt revolver her father had kept beneath the counter. Her hands, slick with sweat, fumbled with the unfamiliar weight. She was no gunslinger, just a merchant's daughter who had learned that fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. Through the dust and smoke, she saw the gang's leader. He sat astride a powerful black warhorse, a silent, imposing figure directing the raid with subtle hand signals. While his men swarmed the bank, he surveyed the street, his gaze sweeping over the storefronts with an unnerving, analytical calm. Then, his eyes cold and calculating above the faded blue of his mask, locked onto her trading post. He dismounted, his movements fluid and economical, and strode directly toward her door. Terror seized Emma, cold and sharp. The other raiders were focused on the bank, on the promise of gold and currency. This man was coming for her. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside, bringing with him the smell of gunpowder and hot dust. He was taller than he'd appeared on horseback, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. He ignored the rifle she shakily pointed at his chest. His gaze swept past the cash box on the counter, past the shelves of valuable goods, sacks of flour, tins of coffee, bolts of cloth. His eyes scanned the room, as if searching for something specific. They came to rest on the small private alcove behind the counter, where she kept the few personal items that had survived the journey from Boston. His focus narrowed on a single object, a silver pocket watch, its casing intricately engraved with the initials J.C., resting on a tarnished chain. It had been her brother's, James Carter, a ghost who had died in the war, whose memory was preserved in this last tangible piece of him. It was worthless to a thief, its value purely sentimental, a private anchor in the swirling sea of her grief. "Please," Emma whispered, her voice a raw thread of sound. "Not that. Take anything else." The masked man didn't seem to hear her. He moved toward the alcove, his steps deliberate. He walked past the end of the counter, forcing her to either back away or be cornered. Her finger tightened on the trigger, the hammer clicking back with a sound that seemed deafeningly loud in the sudden quiet. He stopped, his head tilting slightly, those cold eyes fixed on her. "I wouldn't," he said, his voice low and devoid of any discernible accent. It was not a threat, but a simple statement of fact, a calm assessment of the situation. He knew with absolute certainty that she would not shoot. And he was right. The will to pull the trigger simply wasn't in her. With a final dismissive glance at her, he reached out and plucked the watch from its hook. He coiled the chain around his gloved fingers, the silver glinting in the dim light. He didn't even look at it. He simply pocketed it, turned, and walked out of the trading post as calmly as he had entered. Emma stood frozen, the heavy revolver suddenly feeling useless in her hand. Outside, a sharp whistle cut through the air. The outlaws emerged from the ruined bank, their saddlebags bulging. Within seconds, they were mounted and gone, a whirlwind of dust and thunder receding down the street, leaving behind a shattered, smoking silence. The townsfolk slowly emerged from their hiding places, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief. Emma didn't move. She stared at the empty space where the watch had been. They hadn't robbed her. They had violated her. The leader had ignored a register full of money to steal a memory, to take the one thing that connected her to the brother she had lost. The act was so specific, so deeply and inexplicably personal, that it transcended mere robbery. It was a message. And as she lowered the gun, a new feeling began to smolder beneath the ashes of her fear, a cold, hard resolve. She didn't know who that man was or why he had come. But she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that she would find out why he wanted her brother's watch. In the days following the raid, a heavy pall settled over redemption. The outlaws, dubbed the Ghost Gang by the territorial newspapers for their habit of striking without warning and vanishing without a trace, had become more than just a threat. They were a legend. They had hit a dozen towns and stagecoaches across the territory, always with the same unnerving military precision, leaving local law enforcement baffled and terrified. Sheriff Miller, a man whose weary face seemed permanently etched with the anxieties of his office, could offer Emma little more than sympathy. He sat in her trading post 2 days after the robbery, his coffee growing cold in his hands. "They were professionals, Miss Carter," he said, shaking his head. "Not your usual bunch of drunk cowboys. They knew the layout of the bank, knew when the payroll shipment was due. It was planned." "But they didn't just rob the bank," Sheriff Emma insisted, her voice tight. "Their leader came in here. He took nothing of monetary value, only a pocket watch." The sheriff sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. "I understand it feels personal, ma'am. But in the chaos of a robbery, maybe he just grabbed the first shiny thing he saw." He walked past the cash box to get it. Emma countered, her frustration mounting. He looked for it. He knew it was there. Sheriff Miller shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He was a good man, but he was overwhelmed, a single lawman responsible for a county larger than some eastern states. "There's not much I can do," he admitted, his gaze falling to the floor. "We sent a wire to the U.S. Marshals, but the Ghost Gang, they leave no trail. It's like they ride into the wind and disappear." His words offered no comfort. Emma was alone in this, just as she was alone in everything else. The town viewed her with a new kind of pity, now tinged with suspicion. A woman couldn't run a business alone, they whispered. It was only a matter of time before she attracted trouble. The robbery was seen not as a random act of violence, but as a consequence of her stubborn independence. Her isolation was a physical presence, as real as the dust motes dancing in the shafts of afternoon light that pierced the gloom of her store. Grief was her only constant companion. It sat with her during the long, silent evenings and was the first thing to greet her in the gray light of dawn. The theft of James's watch had given that grief a new, sharper edge. It was no longer a passive sorrow, but an active wound, a mystery that demanded a solution. Her obsession with the watch became her reason for getting out of bed in the morning. She channeled her morning into a quiet, desperate investigation. She wrote letters to old family friends, to anyone who had known James during the war, asking if the watch held some hidden significance she was unaware of. She began piecing together scraps of information about the ghost gang, listening to the hushed conversations of travelers and prospectors who passed through her post. They spoke of the gang's discipline, their use of military signals, and the strange pattern of their raids, which seemed designed to disrupt supply lines and sow chaos rather than simply to accumulate wealth. The Arizona Territory itself was a land of simmering tensions. Settlers encroached on lands the Apache had considered theirs for centuries, leading to sporadic, brutal conflicts that left both sides bloodied and bitter. Life was a constant struggle for survival, and Emma's personal quest seemed a small, insignificant thing against the backdrop of this larger, more elemental conflict. Yet for her, it was everything. Recovering that silver watch was no longer just about honoring her brother's memory. It was about reclaiming a piece of herself, about proving she was not just a victim of circumstance, but an agent of her own fate. The watch was the key, the one thread she could pull to unravel the violent chaos that had torn her life apart. Several days later, the sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The oppressive heat of the day was beginning to yield to the cool embrace of the desert night. Emma was preparing to close the trading post, sliding the heavy wooden bar across the front door, when a shadow fell across the threshold of the back entrance, which she had left open to catch the evening breeze. She spun around her hand instinctively, going to the Colt revolver she now kept tucked in her waistband. A man stood silhouetted against the fading light. He was tall and lean, his features obscured by the twilight, but the long black hair and the quiet stillness of his posture identified him immediately as an Apache. Emma's breath caught. Stories of Apache raids were the ghost stories of the frontier, whispered around campfires to frighten children and unnerve newcomers. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. The man stepped forward into the lamplight of the store. He was younger than she expected, with high cheekbones and intelligent dark eyes that held no malice, only a startling intensity. He wasn't dressed for war, wearing simple buckskin leggings and a plain cotton shirt. "My name is Matau," he said, his English precise, with only a trace of an accent. He didn't ask for water or goods. He looked past her, his gaze sweeping the empty street outside the front window. "They are coming back." Emma frowned, confused. "Who is coming back?" "The men who stole from you," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "The ghost gang. But they are not common bandits. They are something more dangerous." A chill entirely unrelated to the cooling air snaked its way down Emma's spine. "How do you know this? Why are you telling me?" "I have been tracking them," Matau said simply. "Their trail crosses my people's land. They move like soldiers, but they are not soldiers. And this time, they do not come for the town's gold. They come for you." The quiet certainty in his voice was more terrifying than any overt threat. Before she could question him further, a faint, familiar sound drifted on the evening air, the rhythmic drumming of approaching horses, many of them moving fast. Matau's entire demeanor shifted. The calm intensity sharpened into a razor-edged alertness. They are here. Panic, cold and suffocating, rose in Emma's throat. She glanced wildly around the trading post, her sanctuary, which now felt like a trap. Matau held her gaze, his expression unreadable but urgent. He offered her a choice, stark and absolute. "You can stay and face them, or you can come with me and live." The hoofbeats were louder now, a thunderous announcement of their arrival at the edge of town. There was no time to think, no time to weigh options. there was only the primal instinct to survive. The memory of the leader's cold eyes, the violation of her home, the certainty that they were returning for her, it all coalesced into a single, terrifying truth. Staying meant death or worse. With a last, wrenching look at the life she was about to leave behind, her father's legacy, her only home in this unforgiving land, Emma made her choice. She grabbed a small satchel containing her journal and a few coins, and nodded to the Apache warrior. "I'll come with you." As Matau led her out the back door and into the deepening shadows of the desert, the ghost gang rode into the main street of redemption, their dark forms moving like wraiths in the twilight. Emma didn't look back. She ran, leaving everything behind, plunging into the vast, unknown wilderness with a man who was, until a few moments ago, a complete stranger. The Arizona desert was a crucible. By day, the sun was a malevolent eye in a bleached white sky, searing the landscape to a uniform shade of red and brown. The air shimmered with heat, distorting the horizon into a watery illusion. By night, the temperature plummeted, and the world was transformed into a realm of silver and shadow under an endless star-filled sky. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind or the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. For Emma, the journey was a grueling test of body and soul. Her city-bred constitution rebelled against the relentless hardship. Her muscles ached, her skin burned, and her mind reeled from the sheer, overwhelming emptiness of the land. The landscape was a gallery of death and the skeletal remains of sun-bleached cattle, the thorny husks of desiccated cacti, the vast, empty spaces where nothing seemed to live. Matau moved through this unforgiving world with a quiet, confident grace. The desert was not his enemy. It was his home. He read the subtle signs of the earth, a bent twig, a disturbed patch of sand, the flight of a bird, with the ease of a scholar reading a familiar book. He was patient with her, but firm. Their dialogue was concise, stripped to the essentials of survival. "Drink now," he would say, handing her the water skin. "But only a little. Your body must learn to hold it." How much farther, she would ask, her voice raw with exhaustion. "As far as we must go," he would reply, his eyes constantly scanning their back trail. Her initial distrust of him slowly began to erode, worn away by the undeniable reality of her dependence. He taught her without lecturing. He showed her how to find water seeping from rock faces, how to identify the few edible plants that clung to life in the arid soil, how to build a small smokeless fire that would not betray their position. She was a reluctant student at first, her pride chafing at her ignorance. But the stark logic of survival was a powerful teacher. They were not just fleeing. They were being hunted. On the third day, Matau pointed to a distant plume of dust rising against the northern sky. "Riders," he said, his voice grim. "3 of them. They know how to track." The knowledge that they were being actively pursued sharpened the edge of Emma's fear. The hunters were a small, skilled contingent of the ghost gang, relentless and cunning. The flight became a deadly game of cat and mouse. Matau led them through winding canyons and treacherous badlands, using the terrain to mask their trail. They traveled by night, resting during the hottest parts of the day in whatever sliver of shade they could find. During one of these enforced halts, huddled beneath a rocky overhang that offered scant protection from the midday sun, Emma's defiance finally broke. "Why are you doing this?" She asked, the question erupting from a well of exhaustion and fear. "Why are you helping me? What do you want from me?" Matau looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to see straight through her defenses. "The men who hunt you are my enemies as well," he said. "They bring violence to the land. They disrupt the balance. My fight is not with you. But your people and mine, we're at war," she said, echoing the sentiment she had heard 100 times in Redemption. A flicker of something sadness, perhaps, or weariness crossed his face. My people want only to live as we have always lived. It is your people who have brought war to us. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the hot, still air. I am not helping a white woman. I am helping a person whose life is in danger. In the eyes of the Creator, that is all that matters. His simple, profound statement dismantled a lifetime of prejudice she hadn't even been fully aware of carrying. She looked at him, then truly looked at him, and saw not an Apache warrior, not a feared savage from a campfire story, but a man of quiet dignity and strength, a man who was risking his life to save hers. In that moment, something shifted inside her. The last vestiges of her distrust gave way to a fragile, burgeoning respect. They were no longer captor and captive, or rescuer and victim. They were two people alone in the wilderness, bound together by a common enemy and the shared, desperate will to survive. After nearly a week of relentless travel, the landscape began to change. The barren rock and sand gave way to scattered juniper and pinon pines. They were climbing into the high country, a maze of hidden canyons and forested mesas that was the heart of Apache territory. At last they reached Matau's destination, a hidden sanctuary, a camp nestled in a valley so well concealed that they were upon it before Emma even realized it was there. Dozens of Wickiup's dome-shaped dwellings made of branches and hides were scattered among the trees. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat. Children played in a nearby stream, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls, while women tended to cooking fires and men mended tools and weapons. It was a world away from the dusty, tense streets of redemption. Emma's arrival caused an immediate stir. The children fell silent, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The adults stopped their work, their expressions guarded and suspicious. She was an outsider, an enemy, a symbol of the world that was relentlessly encroaching on theirs. She felt the weight of their collective gaze, and for the first time since leaving redemption, a new kind of fear took hold. The fear of not belonging. Matau spoke to the tribe's elder, a man with a face like a weathered map of the surrounding mountains, his voice calm and authoritative. The discussion was long and intense, with many suspicious glances cast in Emma's direction. Finally, the elder gave a reluctant nod. You may stay, Matau translated for her. You are under my protection. Any trouble you cause will fall upon my head. The integration was gradual and challenging. Emma was given a small Wickiup of her own, but she remained isolated, an object of distrust. Yet, slowly, small kindnesses began to break through the wall of suspicion. An older woman named Nahima, whose gentle eyes held a deep sadness, offered her a piece of freshly baked bread. A child, bolder than the rest, shyly handed her a brightly colored feather. Emma, in turn, began to unlearn the prejudices of her past. She saw not a collection of savages, but a resilient community rich with tradition and bound by a deep connection to the land. She watched the women work their hands skilled and efficient, and felt a pang of shame at her own helplessness. She listened to the stories of the elders and began to understand their history, a history of loss and resistance that was never taught in the schools back east. During this time, Matau revealed more of his own story. He had been taken as a boy and sent to a mission school, a place designed to kill the Indian and save the man. He had learned English arithmetic and the white man's religion, but he had also learned their hypocrisy and cruelty. He eventually escaped, returning to his people with a unique understanding of both worlds, an insight that made him a valuable leader. He and Emma began their investigation in earnest. In the relative safety of the camp, they pieced together the clues she had gathered. They used cavalry signals, Emma recalled remembering the leader's silent commands during the raid. And their rifles are Army-issue Springfields, Matau added. He had found a shell casing near one of their cold camps during the pursuit. Better than anything the settlers or my people carry. They spoke to other Apache Scouts warriors who had crossed paths with the Ghost Gang. The stories were all the same. The gang's raids were too strategic, their targets too specific. They weren't just stealing. They were disrupting the territory, hitting telegraph lines, burning railroad bridges, and ambushing supply wagons destined for army forts. Their actions seemed designed to create chaos, to make the territory appear ungovernable. The greatest mystery remained the watch. Why would a man leading a small army of outlaws want a simple family heirloom? Emma asked one evening, sitting by a small fire with Matau. Perhaps it is not so simple, Matau suggested. Sometimes the smallest key opens the largest door. His words lingered in her mind. She thought back to her brother James. He had been a captain in the Union Army, a man of fierce integrity and quiet courage. He had died in a skirmish near the end of the war, a hero's death according to the official report. The watch had been his most prized possession. Could it hold a secret he had taken to his grave? The mystery deepened, connecting the violence of the present to the sorrows of her past, and Emma knew she could not rest until she found the answer. The fragile peace of the Apache camp was shattered by the arrival of a weary scout, bearing news from the world of the white man. A new hero had emerged in the territory, Captain James Wilson, a decorated cavalry officer tasked by the government with a single crucial mission to hunt down and destroy the Ghost Gang. The territorial newspapers were filled with tales of his bravery and cunning. He was celebrated in the saloons and parlors of Prescott and Tucson as the man who would finally bring law and order to the frontier. The name, however, struck a different chord with Emma. James Wilson, she repeated, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. I knew a James Wilson back in Boston. He was a friend of my brother's. They served together in the war. Matau's expression grew thoughtful. A coincidence, perhaps. But in my experience, there are no coincidences in a world this small. A few days later, their quiet investigation yielded its most significant breakthrough. An Apache hunting party stumbled upon a mortally wounded outlaw left for dead by his own companions after a skirmish with a rival gang. Before he died, he pressed a tattered hand-drawn map into the hands of the warrior, who found him gasping a single word: Wilson. That evening, Emma and Matau spread the map out on a hide in her wiki-up, the flickering firelight casting long shadows across the crudely drawn lines. It depicted a network of trails and canyons, with a single prominent location marked with an X, an abandoned Spanish mission fort deep in a region patrolled exclusively by the U.S. cavalry. This makes no sense, Emma murmured, tracing the lines with her finger. This is the gang's secret meeting point. Why would they meet in the one place the cavalry is most likely to find them? Matau stared at the map, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He pointed to the name the dying outlaw had spoken. Wilson. Then he pointed to the X marking the fort. Wilson's patrols. He looked at Emma, and in the depths of his dark eyes, she saw the horrifying truth begin to dawn. The pieces clicked into place with the sickening finality of a coffin lid being nailed shut. Captain James Wilson, the celebrated hero, the man tasked with destroying the Ghost Gang, was not hunting them at all. He was leading them. The devastating twist reshaped everything. Wilson wasn't a hero. He was a brilliant, vengeful man using his military position as the perfect cover. The cavalry patrols reported in the newspapers were often his own outlaws disguised in stolen uniforms. His celebrated hunt was a charade, a public performance designed to eliminate his rivals, solidify his control over the territory, and mask his true activities. The entire criminal enterprise, the raids, the disruptions, the chaos, was orchestrated by a man sworn to uphold the law, and it was all funded by the very crimes he was supposed to be solving. And this man, this monster masquerading as a savior, had been her brother's friend. The theft of the watch was no longer a mystery. It was a threat, a personal message sent from a ghost of her past. Wilson was as cunning as he was ruthless. He must have had spies everywhere, because it wasn't long before he learned that the White Squaw and her Apache protector were closing in on his secret. His response was swift, brutal, and designed to silence them permanently. He launched a two-pronged attack, turning the very systems he commanded against them. First, he struck at Matau's people. Under the cover of darkness, Wilson's gang, disguised as Apache warriors, descended on a small, isolated settlement of white farmers, slaughtering the inhabitants and burning the homestead to the ground. They were careful to leave behind Apache artifacts, a broken arrow here, a beaded moccasin there, to ensure the blame fell correctly. The news of the massacre spread like wildfire, igniting a firestorm of rage and fear across the territory. The newspapers screamed for vengeance. Settlers formed vigilante mobs. And most devastatingly, the U.S. Army, under pressure to respond officially, sanctioned a full-scale campaign against Matau's tribe. Captain Wilson, the man who had secretly orchestrated the atrocity, was publicly lauded for his grim determination as he prepared to lead the hunt for the savages responsible. The frame-up was perfect. It turned the local populace and the U.S. military into Wilson's personal army, driving Matau's people from their hidden sanctuary. The camp had to be abandoned in a matter of hours, the tribe scattering into the mountains, hunted and reviled for a crime they did not commit. Wilson's second attack was aimed directly at Emma. A territorial marshal arrived in Redemption with a warrant for her arrest. She was publicly named as an accomplice to the ghost gang, a traitor who had turned against her own people. Posters appeared in every town, her face crudely drawn above the words, "Emma Carter, the White Squaw. Wanted for treason and complicity in murder. $500 reward, dead or alive." The news reached them through a friendly Mexican trader who showed them one of the wanted posters. Seeing her own face twisted into the caricature of a villain struck Emma with a visceral shock. Wilson had not only made her a fugitive from the law, he had made her a target for every bounty hunter, vigilante, and fortune seeker in the territory. He had stripped her of her name, her history, and her identity, turning her into a pariah. They were utterly alone fugitives from both the law and the lawless. Hunted by the outlaws they sought to expose, and the soldiers who believed they were dispensing justice, they had nowhere to run. The world had been turned upside down, with the true villain celebrated as a hero, and the truth-seekers branded as criminals. Trapped and desperate, Emma and Matau realized they had only one option left. They could not outrun Wilson's power. They had to confront him. They had to lure him into a trap of their own and force the truth into the light, or die trying. The bait was a message sent through channels they knew Wilson monitored, hinting that they had found something of immense value in the ruins of the old San Xavier mission, something related to a man named James Carter. As they'd hoped, Wilson's vanity and his obsession with the past were too strong to resist. He agreed to a meeting, but on his own terms. The confrontation would take place inside the crumbling mission chapel alone. Emma and Matau knew it was a lie. He would not come alone. The mission stood like a skeleton against the bruised purple sky. A storm was rolling in from the west, the air thick and heavy with the smell of rain and ozone. Lightning spiderwebbed across the horizon, each flash illuminating the chapel's collapsed bell tower and hollow staring windows. Inside, the air was cold and musty. Rain began to lash against the broken roof, dripping onto the stone floor and echoing through the vast, empty space. Emma and Matau took their positions in the shadows, their weapons ready, their senses on high alert. Wilson arrived not as a cavalry captain, but as the outlaw leader flanked by his core group of loyal men. They entered the chapel silently, spreading out to cover all exits, their movements practiced and professional. Wilson himself strode to the center of the nave, his face hidden by the same blue bandana he'd worn in redemption. Lightning flashed, and for a brief, terrifying moment, the chapel was lit as bright as day, revealing him standing over the desecrated altar. "I know you're here, Carter's sister," he called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Come out. Let's finish this." Emma stepped out from behind a pillar, her father's revolver held steady in her hands. Matau remained hidden, a silent arrow nocked in his bow. "It was always you, wasn't it, Wilson?" Emma said, her voice clear and strong above the rising howl of the wind. Wilson slowly pulled down his mask, a cruel, humorless smile twisting his lips. His face was harder than she remembered the boyish charm she'd known in Boston, replaced by a cold, intellectual cruelty. "You were always the smart one, Emma. A pity you chose the wrong side." "Why?" she demanded. "My brother considered you a friend. Why destroy my family? Why steal his watch?" The storm broke in full fury. A deafening clap of thunder shook the mission to its foundations. In the ensuing flash of lightning, Wilson's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "Your brother," he spat, the name dripping with venom, "was a traitor. We were in the war together. Did he tell you that? We were brothers in arms. But on the battlefield, when it mattered most, he betrayed me. He reported a tactical decision. I made a necessary, difficult decision as a violation of orders. It led to my court-martial. It ruined my career, destroyed my name. While your brother was being hailed as a hero, I was being drummed out of the service in disgrace." His voice dropped to a low, chilling whisper. "I lost everything. My commission, my honor. I returned home a broken man. My wife, my daughter. They died from fever and starvation because a disgraced soldier couldn't provide for them. Your brother's honor killed my family." He took a step closer, his eyes burning with a righteous fury. "So I came west, just like your father, to start a new life. A life of my own, making with my own rules. I built an army and empire, and I made a vow. I would take from your family everything it had taken from me. I started with your father's pathetic little business, and I would have ended with you. The watch, it was a symbol, a reminder of the man who started it all, the man I hold responsible for every moment of my suffering." His confession hung in the air, a tale of twisted revenge so profound it was almost believable. But as another flash of lightning lit the chapel, an arrow hissed out of the darkness, embedding itself in the wooden altar, just inches from Wilson's hand. Matau stepped from the shadows, his face a mask of cold fury. "You lie," he said, his voice ringing with authority. Wilson stared at him, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. What would a savage know of honor? "I know more than you think," Matau replied, stepping into the light. "I was there. Not in the war, but near your fort. My people traded with the soldiers. I knew Captain Carter, and I knew you." He turned his gaze to Emma, the secondary, more terrible twist finally being revealed. "Your brother did not betray Wilson Matau," said, his voice softening with empathy for the pain he was about to cause her. He was about to expose him. Wilson was selling army weapons to Confederate irregulars. War profiteering. James discovered the truth and was going to report him to the High Command. Wilson couldn't let that happen. The full, monstrous truth slammed into Emma, her brother's death. The heroic last stand, where James died. Matau continued, his eyes locked on Wilson. It was a setup. Wilson sent him into an ambush. He arranged for your brother to die to silence him forever. He didn't just ruin his own name, he murdered the man who threatened to expose his crimes. Wilson's smile vanished, replaced by a snarl of pure rage. The final secret was out. And the watch Matau said, his voice dropping as he delivered the final blow. James knew he was in danger. He suspected Wilson would move against him. He left you a message. Inside the watch casing, there is an inscription. Wilson's carefully constructed world of lies collapsed around him. With a roar of fury, he drew his pistol. "Kill them," he screamed to his men. "Kill them all." The chapel erupted into a storm of gunfire and violence. Lightning flashes provided the only illumination, freezing the combatants in stark, terrifying tableaus. It was a battle of wits and weapons of cold calculation against desperate courage. Matau moved like a phantom in the shadows, his arrows finding their marks with deadly precision. Emma, no longer a frightened merchant's daughter, fought with a newfound strength, firing, reloading, and taking cover with the instincts of a survivor. Amidst the chaos of the raging storm and the deadly gunfight, she fought not for land or money, but for her brother's stolen honor, and for the future she and Matau had dared to believe in. The battle was short and brutal. In the disorienting flashes of lightning and the deafening roar of the storm, Wilson's men were thrown into confusion, picked off one by Matau's ghostly efficiency and Emma's steady fire. The climax came when Wilson, his numbers dwindling, finally faced Emma across the ruined chancel. He raised his pistol to fire, but a final desperate shot from Emma's revolver struck his arm, sending his weapon clattering across the stone floor. Before he could recover, Matau was upon him, the warrior's strength overwhelming the disgraced captain. The fight was over. As dawn broke, the storm subsided, leaving behind a world washed clean. A cool, gentle light filtered through the chapel's broken windows, illuminating the scene of destruction. Wilson and his surviving men were bound, their reign of terror finally at an end. Emma walked over to where Wilson knelt defeated and retrieved her brother's watch from his pocket. The silver felt cool and solid in her palm, a piece of her past finally returned. She and Matau tended to each other's wounds, a shallow cut on his arm, a deep bruise on her shoulder, their movements slow and deliberate. There was no triumph in their victory, only the profound weariness of survivors who had unearthed a painful buried truth. The raw emotional weight of the night settled upon them. They left Wilson and his men for the territorial marshals to find, along with a written confession they forced from the captain, detailing his crimes, including the murder of James Carter. They knew, however, that the white world would likely never believe their full story. The tale of a renegade Apache and a white squaw exposing a decorated war hero would be dismissed as a fantastic lie. They made a choice then not to seek validation or justice from a world that had branded them as outcasts, but to find their own peace on their own terms. They had fought for the truth, not for the sake of a court or a newspaper, but for themselves and for the memory of a good man. Weeks later, they returned to redemption. The town was much as they had left it, a dusty, sun-baked collection of buildings clinging to the edge of the wilderness. But for Emma, it was a world away. The trading post was boarded up, a relic of a life she no longer knew. They bypassed the town and rode to the small, lonely plot of land where her father was buried. The simple wooden cross stood against the vast, empty landscape. In the weeks since the confrontation at the mission, Emma had carefully worked open the back casing of the pocket watch. Inside, scratched into the silver with the tip of a knife, was the inscription her brother had left behind. The lettering was tiny, almost invisible to the naked eye, a secret meant only for someone who knew to look. It read, "Truth is a heavier burden than command. J.W. sells honor for gold. Forgive me." The words were a final heartbreaking confirmation of Matau's story. They absolved her brother of any guilt and solidified the truth of his sacrifice. He hadn't been a victim. He had been a man trying to do the right thing in a world where honor was a cheap commodity. Emma knelt by the grave. She had cleaned and polished the silver watch until it shone in the morning sun. For a long time, she simply held it, feeling its weight a tangible link to the ghosts that had haunted her for so long. Then, in a powerful symbolic act, she gently placed the watch on the rough-hewn grave marker, resting it against the wood. It was a final letting go. She was releasing the ghosts of her past, her father, her brother, and the frightened, grieving woman she used to be. She was no longer defined by her loss or her old life. She stood up and turned to Matau, who had been waiting patiently, giving her this moment alone. The desert sun caught the glints of silver in his black hair. He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a deep, quiet understanding. She was not the woman he had found in this trading post months ago, and he was not just the warrior who had warned her of danger. They had been forged into something new in the crucible of the desert, in the heart of the storm. She walked to him and took his outstretched hand. His grip was warm and strong, a steady anchor in her new world. Together, without a word, they mounted their horses and turned them south toward the distant, hazy peaks of the Sierra Madre Mountains. They rode not as fugitives escaping a past they couldn't change, but as partners choosing a future they would build together. They were two survivors who had found in the harshest of landscapes not just a home in a place, but a home in each other, riding toward a shared horizon, a new life waiting just beyond the next rise.